everyone. Welcome to the Trial Site News podcast. I'm Dr. Erin Stair, your host, and today's topic is all about the issues with vaccine passports. We see a lot of countries implementing them. We see states. So this is a hot topic right now. People feel very strongly about it. And here to discuss this topic with me is Dr. Dimitry Kochenov, who is also who's known as the vaccine or the passport professor, not the vaccine passport professor, but the passport professor. So
a passport is a passport.
So Dimitry, thank you so much for joining us. And if you don't mind taking the opportunity to introduce yourself.
So I teach at the Central European University in Vienna, and I work at the Central European University in Budapest as a professor of the rule of law. And my main subject matter in life basically is citizenship and passports. So COVID passports, obviously. I got one over here. This is something that fascinates me.
And you've written about, this is how I found you, because you've written about this topic. And I found what you wrote very interesting because you made me think about it in different ways, or different issues that I didn't think about. And I work in public health, and people feel very, some people are for them, some people are against them. My bias is I tend to be against them for a lot of the issues that you talked about. But for the sake of being fair and that kind of thing, I suppose, can you just basically go over the reasons why people support vaccine passports?
Well, officially, governments tell us that in order to come back to normal after this horrible COVID time, we need some kind of a special certification that we are fine for mingling with other people. That would be checked by private businesses and also government employees. And for this reason, acting on the premise that everyone who is vaccinated is safe and everyone who is in contact with vaccinated people is safe, the main line is that these passports allow us to reopen the world and to come back to normal. And as we will come to this, most likely this is not what will actually happen, because the official story is very positive, but it also has a negative side. And this negative side is not only about those people who don't really feel like getting vaccinated, but also about what these passports actually attest to, and whether health is the main driver as opposed to other government interests and other considerations that should be taken into account.
Right. So let's dive into a paper you co-wrote with Jacqueline Veraldi. Veraldi, titled "The Commission Against the Internal Market and EU Citizens' Rights, Trying to Shoot Down Sputnik with a Digital Green Certificate." That was in May 2021. You write a lot about how the digital green certificate can be used to discriminate some people, not others, by restricting their movement. And you also touch on how this might clash with the law, the European Union law. Can you elaborate on that?
The paper we co-wrote for the European Journal of Risk Regulation, actually, it has just been published 2 days ago. It deals with the European context, and it deals with the main story behind this digital COVID certificates. The main story being, we need to show a certificate in order to benefit from any kind of rights that Europe or our state vis-a-vis Europe has to provide. And we find it problematic because the starting premise of EU law dealing with citizens' rights is that every citizen of Europe has a right precisely not to be checked, living a life of rights, liberties, and freedom in the territory of the whole of the Union, not in one particular member state of the Union or two particular member states of the Union, which means that the law guarantees that there is no border and the law guarantees that there is no check. And now the Union comes up with the story that we need an additional document. Once the document is checked, you don't have any more border and you don't have any more restrictions to your or limits to your liberties. And this is not coherent, because obviously in order to check this document, you obviously need to install the border where the law says there is none. So already at the very starting point of thinking about COVID certificates, there is an incoherence. There is something that is sold to us as necessary, while the law actually promises something absolutely different. And then there is another problem with this, which we also touch upon. That is, how do you decide that it is that one border? For instance, the border between the Netherlands and Belgium, or the border between Germany and France, that is actually the border where you need to check your certificate. And here, every single scholar I talked with could predict that, of course, once you introduce a certificate, once you imagine a border, immediately that will not be the only border where the certificate is active. So we heard from President Macron in France that suddenly that border moved to the front door of every single cafe, of every single bar, of every single nightclub, and all the other public places all over France. So all these fears actually come to life. A document that was designed in order to facilitate travel across internal borders within the European Union suddenly is checked between the coffee bar on Boulevard Saint-Michel and the Boulevard, and this is what I think is problematic. And it's problematic even for those who are vaccinated, even for those who do believe in the effectiveness of the vaccines.
Sure.
Because of the sheer the sheer destruction of the idea of the public when we speak about the public space, and the potential problematification, whatever we would call it in English, problematization of anyone who is a potential customer of any business that has any kind of indoor capacity or indoor site to it.
I wanted to, we had conversations before about the politicalization of vaccines. And I know different vaccines have been used all across Europe, but the ones that are only allowed, or the ones that you're able to get this passport, this digital green passport, there's 4 vaccines: Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, and AstraZeneca. Is that still how it stands?
So yeah, and here we come to the main problem with this passport from the point of view of the law.
There's 2, and now in your country you've used Sputnik, right, which is the vaccine from Russia, and also China's vaccine has that been
Sinopharm, one of
Sinopharm,
the so
yeah.
some of the member states use the vaccines which are not yet approved for emergency use by EMA, the European Medicines Authority, which means that those countries cannot legally issue a European digital COVID certificate to any citizen who was administered those vaccines. Of course, there is mounting scientific evidence that Sputnik and Sinopharm are perfectly fine. In fact, Sinopharm got the WHO certification as well, not yet Sputnik, which means that there are no questions at this point at the international level by the international community regarding the effectiveness of the Sinopharm vaccine. Yet the European Union chose the way of being extremely cautious in terms of what is recognized at the national level, at the supranational level, at the level of Europe. Then what are the results of this? The results of this are that plenty of Europeans who are vaccinated, and I'm not only speaking about an odd Hungarian citizen, Hungarian European who got a Sinopharm jab, but also plenty of Europeans who happen to reside outside of Europe, and pretty much all of the former Soviet space, pretty much all of China, plenty of African countries, plenty of Latin American countries use the vaccines which are not good enough in the eyes of EU law in order to be certified by this new passport that allows you to participate in free movement in the Union and actually to benefit from any rights related to moving between countries. So it's a big problem, and an even bigger problem is that this story that brands politicization of vaccines as dealing with health concerns. It's obvious that if someone is vaccinated with Sputnik, that person is not a health hazard anymore, in the same sense as a person who is vaccinated with Pfizer or AstraZeneca. This story has another side, and that side is that it invites bilateral dealings between the member states as to what kind of vaccines those member states of the Union will accept. So already now we have a very strange map, which doesn't really correspond to the map of Europe as we know it from our school textbooks, because, for instance, the Greek government does accept both the Chinese vaccine and the Russian vaccine. The Austrian government doesn't accept the Russian vaccine, but accepts the Chinese vaccine. And there are plenty of governments which would not accept either of the two, while it's of course obvious that that both of them are effective for the purposes for which a vaccine is usually created, namely creating antibodies in your system in order to prevent you from succumbing to the virus. So Europe, which prides itself for the successful unification project that boosts the rights of individual European citizens, actually created a system that goes directly against those rights under the pretext of health concerns, while at the same time opening the doors to bilateral dealings between the member states and also bilateral dealings between particular member states and third countries. So each country now, each member state of the European Union concludes individual agreements related to free movement of persons, or related to the movement of persons, let's say, with all kinds of countries around the world. And the web of these agreements is really, really bizarre. So, for instance, if I look at what the Hungarian government has concluded, I know that Hungarian citizens, whatever is the vaccine, can freely go to Brunei, but at the same time, they cannot drive 1.5 hours away from Budapest to Vienna, because unfortunately, Vienna does not recognize the same vaccination statuses as Brunei does. And then there are all kinds of countries involved, from Montenegro to Ukraine, which would be more welcoming to Hungarian citizens than some of the Western European countries. And of course, you would say at a certain point, all these vaccines which are effective will get European certification, etc. So it will not be a problem. But the problem is here now. So it's clear that this passport will not be needed for long. In fact, there is a clear expiration date in the regulation. So it's not a document that is officially introduced forever, but it is able to poison the very idea of unity when we speak about the European Union as a single working living space, which is the starting point. Imagine, try to superimpose this mental picture on the United States. Imagine each of the United States would recognize different kinds of vaccines, not based on scientific publications, but based on geopolitical concerns to a large degree, and then would issue documents to particular residents which clarify which vaccines that person has been vaccinated with, and then the vaccination map would actually be absolutely random. You never know, and it's impossible to predict which government exactly would actually recognize your status as safe, although scientific journals, if we read the Lancet, would say, well, Sputnik is okay, and even the World Health Organization would tell you, actually, Sinopharm is perfectly fine. So instead of unifying the document, actually, this new passport it disjoins the union under the pretext of unity, and that's precisely why Jacques
I just had this mental disaster. I just had this mental image of the United States, like different states recognizing different passports, which is, the image was painful.
This is how the world works, right? And yeah. In Europe, we obviously pride ourselves by accommodating unity with the sovereignty of the member states. But then the whole point of having the union is to ensure that this sovereignty is stained in terms of any kind of negative consequences that it can create, negative externalities that it can create for the rights of Europeans when any kind of central decisions are taken. So the regulation that introduced this vaccination passport is obviously a central decision by the institutions of the Union. And what we see is that quite astonishingly, quite atypically, instead of bringing unity and further rights, this decision actually opened the doors to dealing and wheeling among the member states and creating impenetrable borders for some of the citizens, as well as this outpour of additional borders, like between the French cafes and the French street. And this is not, of course, the intention of how this COVID certificate was supposed to be used.
Which brings me to another paper that you helped author, which is a great name, Vaccine Passports, a Terrible Great Idea, which kind of perfectly describes what you just explained. But people are worried about their privacy when they hear vaccine passports, especially a digital passport. They worry about privacy, they worry about data leaks. This paper used the term mission creep. Can you elaborate on that? Do people have to worry about their privacy, in your opinion?
It's not only privacy. So I agree with every word you said about worries. This is what we clearly see when we look at the opinion polls. People don't want an increased intrusion into what they consider unshareable with the public authority, right? And history shows that it's very difficult to roll back the tide. In fact, in the majority of cases, it's impossible. So once you start with one document, that document will stay. If you read Zweig, you see there were no passports really, or no meaningful passports before the First World War. Then they were introduced, and now it's impossible even to board a plane, let alone cross any border, without showing that document. In fact, our parents could travel from the US to the Caribbean with a passport card or with nothing. The same with Canada, nobody would check anything. Now it's impossible to really imagine coming back to that reality and going back to that world. And then now think about this new passport that has been just introduced. The likelihood is there that in some form it will still linger and it will still survive, and it will still be shaping our lives in terms of adding yet new boundaries, which we would have difficulties, or the majority of people wouldn't, but many would have difficulties to cross for whatever reason that might even not come to mind today. So it's really a big problem once you start imposing boundaries and once you start inventing new certificates. And of course, more pedestrian problematization of the same is any kind of talk about data leaks and the most physical escape of the data from wherever the data is securely stored. Still last week, there was a huge incident reported in the Netherlands, and it's not the first one and it's not the third one, when dozens of thousands of people data was stolen related to COVID testing and related to private health data. I'm not saying that it's absolutely impossible to create a 100% secure and safe environment where you would store the data, but we know that it's 99.99999% impossible. So the easiest way to deal with this impossibility or with these possible troubles is simply not to start with new kinds of data collection and new kinds of documents that would actually shape, sometimes negatively, the rights that people enjoy in their country and also abroad.
Thank you. So another issue, I work in public health, and we talked about this before, where you see a lot of vaccine hesitancy in historically disadvantaged communities, marginalized communities, and I would imagine that it's similar abroad everywhere. So can you talk about the impact that a vaccine passport can have on communities that have already been hit hard historically? If they're disadvantaged, they may not get the vaccine. There's tons of people in this world that don't even have access to a vaccine. In the US, we're fine. I'm not sure how you guys are doing. I think okay, but there's tons of people in this world who don't even have access. So what is the impact on those people, in your opinion? Do you see anything happening now?
The world is divided into the haves and have-nots, and the countries are divided into the haves and have-nots. So any kind of document that you introduce, new document, any kind of new boundary, does not only single out those who don't have that particular document, it also amplifies the divide between the first world and all the rest, which means that by design, unfortunately, so we can illustrate this with the European digital COVID certificate, since it doesn't take into account any of the third world produced vaccines, well, besides those licensed vaccines that India produces. So no Chinese, no former Soviet Union produced, etc. It's absolutely necessary to see it with the eyes of those formerly colonized and those who are less well off than us. And what they see is that now by law they are treated as a danger, because once the passport tells them that whatever they get vaccinated with, unless it's a Western and EU approved vaccine, that's not good enough for Europe, no matter what science says, they're basically not welcome, not only by virtue of their passport and what kind of visas they have in that passport, but also as a health hazard. And this is an eternal story. Like, don't let the foreigners in; they will bring the disease. This is President Trump speaking about the Chinese virus. These are all the empires of the past introducing all kinds of health control for the colonial subjects to which the
right, they're tropes,
the other citizens
don't let them in, yeah.
So it's a disastrous replay of the same unfortunate story of power and disempowerment, which unfortunately again directly concerns and shapes the lives of hundreds of millions of people all around the world. Because now, no matter whether you're vaccinated or not, since you will be vaccinated with the wrong vaccines, you cannot be booking any flight to Europe from the majority of countries all around the world. And you become a health hazard simply because you are in the third world, simply because you are trying to do your best with what you have, and that is not recognized by law by the authorities in Europe.
Right, it's very stigmatizing. Just continues. I think that was a great explanation. I wanted
but of course the same works at the level of communities within countries. So you're
sure.
Absolutely right. I probably took too global a view.
Well, no, but I think that's true. What you said is 100% accurate. And then, but also
because some people would say it doesn't matter if the foreigners cannot come. Well, fair enough. But then once you look
that's a privileged point of view.
At the disenfranchised communities within your own country, you actually see that besides or beyond vaccine hesitancy, those people objectively, simply because of their socioeconomic status, can have less information and less practical access to what we take for granted.
Right.
And here the European story is actually very interesting because vaccine access is something that was regulated at the national level, and different countries would take different approaches to whom they vaccinate first, how they schedule vaccinations, what that might cost, etc. Well, usually it was for free. So very much depended on where you got stranded during the virus, even if you were European and even if you were inside the European Union. So some countries were faster, other countries were slower, which means that if we need to be vaccinated in order to start traveling, very much is determined by, unfortunately, the country where we ended up at the moment when the vaccination certificate when the regulation was introduced. And this is something that takes control entirely from the hands of the people themselves, because in the majority of contexts, they cannot decide, no matter whether they believe really in the vaccine or whether they simply wanted to travel or they have other concerns. They simply cannot decide for themselves when their turn would come. And this means that citizens of some countries get easier access to the basic rights, which in the European Union means free movement of persons, than citizens of other countries.
I just have a question. I don't know if you know any anecdotes, but are people who got the Russia's vaccine or China's vaccine, are they actually, and they say they want to travel to a place that doesn't recognize them, what are they actually getting, these other vaccines too? Are there cases of that? Do you know?
The interesting thing is that plenty of European countries actually recognize at the bilateral level any kind of vaccinations that happen in the third world, which means that there are now floods of tourists from the Russian Federation and Greece, and it's absolutely fine, but they cannot fly from Greece to any other European country, even if they have a Schengen visa. Well, it depends on who checks what exactly. Of course, at plenty of borders, nobody would ask anything because there is no consistent enforcement, which is probably good. But this is precisely part of what I think is problematic. Instead of making a coherent health concerns-based effort to come up with regulation that makes solid sense and doesn't stigmatize for no reason, what the European Union has done is creating this enclaves which are accessible to the people, including European citizens who got the vaccines, which are the wrong vaccines in the eyes of the EU, and those spaces which would not be accessible. The worst story here, I think, is the story of the treatment of the UK after Brexit, because the UK is treated as the biggest health hazard space. So for Europeans for UK citizens without European passports, meaning the passports of the European Union, it's more and more difficult to travel to the European Union. Of course, it all works reciprocally, and you don't even know how to approach this story rationally, because there appears to be little willingness to talk about what kind of rights should actually be guaranteed to people on both sides of the English Channel. So I recently planned to attend the meeting in Gibraltar. You check the rules, and unfortunately, Gibraltar authorities, Gibraltar being directly dependent, of course, on Spain across the airport, unfortunately, they only accept the vaccinations which are issued by the National Health Service of the United Kingdom. So you can have whatever vaccine you want. It can be exactly the same vaccine as the one that the National Health Service would administer in London. But unfortunately, if this vaccine was administered in Estonia or in Spain, you will still have trouble entering Gibraltar, the last remaining colony, and you will be subjected to all kinds of extortionist practices, like paying for tests or going to quarantine, etc. Which is absolutely unacceptable, but this is the reality in which we live.
That's so interesting. I wanted to ask you about private businesses, because, a lot of private businesses wanted vaccine passports because they said, hey, this is a way to get open again. It's good for the economy. However, in the paper, you guys write about how if you make vaccine passports mandatory, you put duties on private citizens, private business owners to enforce them, to enforce these rules coming from governments. What sort of problems can we run into if that happens?
Well, enforcing rules is costly, first of all. So you always need to have someone at the door, and you need to turn your lovely customers away for reasons that do not concern you directly. And of course, plenty of industries, especially the airline industry, were lobbying for the passports, but they started in the wrong moment when vaccines were not widely available. So almost nobody would have a passport like that, obviously. And now we come to the point when larger and larger portion of the population is vaccinated. So it's unclear how the vaccine certificate would actually be useful in any way. If vaccination is going at the same pace as it's going now. And of course, I'm not a health expert, but it's absolutely obvious that as long as the vaccine passport is not the only way to cross borders, and in the majority of cases in Europe, this is not. You can also have PCR tests, etc. The relevance of these documents is exceedingly low. So plenty of problems arise there. And of course, there is also a black market, like with any other passport or any other certificate. So we hear more and more how much a certificate would cost, for instance, in the suburbs of Moscow, and the prices are not really high. But you can write whatever vaccine you want, apparently, and it will cost you $100, $150. Plenty of people dislike the idea of vaccination. It's their choice, and we will not comment on that. But we should be aware of this black market as well.
That's interesting. And then a business could potentially be given a hefty fine if they're caught violating the rules, right?
Well, it depends. It always depends on enforcement. We have the example of airlines in this field, when effectively all the document checks, visa checks, etc., have been outsourced by the governments to the airlines. The airlines suffer huge repercussions if they don't take their enforcement role seriously. But of course, if you would ask any airline officials in private, this is an additional task, and this is an additional cost, which was simply imposed on them under threat of economic violence, basically, by all the states around the world. So it's an open question whether you want to do exactly the same. And of course, if you enforce harshly, then everybody will comply. But you need to keep this cost in mind. And the question remains whether you want to have exactly the same happening to every bartender and every restaurant owner everywhere else on the continent. That's precisely why, when we read the regulation in Europe, it's clear that the passport was not intended to be used at the door of private businesses. But this doesn't prevent plenty of countries de facto from using it in such a way. Because if we take France, for instance, right now.
I was just going to bring up France, yeah.
Of course, because France is the first, the second probably after Hungary, to my knowledge, where this kind of policy has been introduced. But the Hungarians kept this policy alive only for a very short time, until a certain percentage of the population got vaccinated. And then all that was cancelled. In France, we don't have, correct me if I'm wrong, a very clear time frame as to when this approach is to be reversed. So what is going on in France is that all the non-French travelers who got into France and who need to have a coffee al banco somewhere inside the bar will have to show precisely the European health certificate, because they don't have any other. Because they wouldn't have any kind of French issued document that would be the local equivalent, which means that in practice, the document that was designed to cross borders will be used to get your morning coffee. And this is where a totally different scale of problems starts.
It's a fascinating time in history, that's for sure. Dimitry, thank you so much for that discussion. It was very interesting. And if people want to read these papers that you wrote, are they on your website? I'm happy to share, but if they want to learn more about you, where can they go? I know you've written a book too.
Yeah, if you could share the links, it would be.
I will.
So the first paper, the one that was co-authored with Jacqueline Veraldi from Cambridge, is in open access on the webpage of European Journal of Risk Regulation, and it's actually a special issue that only deals exclusively with the problems that arise out of the introduction of this European COVID certificates, which was edited by two brilliant scholars, by Luisa Belashevich from Amsterdam and Alberto Alemano from Haute École Commerciale in Paris. And the other paper is on the webpage of Compass Oxford. This is a part of the School of Anthropology that deals with migration.
And I'll share them with the viewers too. And to our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in. And please let us know how you feel about vaccine passports in the comments. It's always good to hear what you guys are thinking. And Dimitry, thank you so much again for joining and sharing your expertise with us.
It was a great pleasure, Erin. Thank you very much.
Yes, the passport professor, but now maybe the vaccine passport professor.
A passport is a passport. Yes.
A passport is a passport. Okay. Take care, Dimitry. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Bye-bye.